Everyone, how's it going? Welcome to week 5, and we're going to be talking about semantics. I hope I'm gesturing in the right way. I'm trying to remember which way my video goes when I record these. In any event, let me turn off my little portable heater here, just in case it's adding too much noise. We don't want that. These chapters are a little bit shorter this week. I don't think the content's necessarily shorter, but chapters 21 and 22 are a little bit on the shorter side, so a little bit easier to dive into. Because as we're going through this, we're getting to the point where we're week 5, we're more than halfway through the course, we're building on what we already know. So you should be spending a decent amount of time we're building on that foundational knowledge. And if there's some pieces of that foundational knowledge that you're still not 100% with all of it yet, then go back and review because it's all just important stuff that you need to know. And again, these are slides that Dr. Z created. So some of these, I took my own notes, so I might be glossing over some of this. I'll still provide these to you along with, you can take notes on what I'm saying too, but I tend to learn better when I have examples and things. So I spent more time kind of going through the chapters and writing examples and things to kind of talk about these concepts, because I think that makes more sense. So when we talk about semantics, Unit 21 talks about the meaning of individual signs, and then Unit 22, the meaning of sentences. So Chapter 21, the meaning of individual signs. So let's define semantics, which is the study of the meaning of words and sentences. Language users share rules for each part of language, including phonology, morphology, syntax, which we've already talked about all of those, and now to the semantics. Determining meaning. Well, how do you know what a sign means when someone signs something? And as we talked about all the way back in week 1, I believe it was, meaning is derived from the combination of movements, holds, hand shapes, location, orientation, and non-manual signals. And knowing that meaning, again, it's arbitrary, but we've all agreed upon that set of rules so that we know when we see a certain sign, that's what it means when you have this movement and this hold and this hand shape in this orientation. As I mentioned, phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, it's a specific community of language users, and we agree upon what that meaning is. And that's why it's different in different languages, because there's different rules, but the threads are pretty much the same. If you understand the rules, then you can theoretically understand the language. Communication needs these 3 things in order to work: context, culture, and community, the 3 C's. There's 3 types of meanings that the authors talk about in the book. There's the referential meaning, which is the sign, word, sentence. It references or describes an idea, a thing, or a state of being. It's literally just, this is what the sign means. No deeper than that. This is what it represents. The social meaning is a sign choice or sentence production that can describe the social identity of the user. And the affective meaning is the sign or sentence production that describes the signer's attitudes, feelings, or opinions concerning the topic being discussed. So I'm looking at my notes. Well, let me get to the next slide first. So denotation versus connotation. So denotation is the exact or literal meaning of a word, or the dictionary definition. So if you looked it up, this is what the word means. Denotations are referential, and connotation has more to do with the feelings and ideas that words have. And the connotation could be positive or it could be negative. So when we think about things like connotation, it could also mean the social meaning, which is also the affective meaning. So when we think about certain words, they can have different meanings depending on a lot of different variables. So for example, there are words and phrases or signs that tend to be gender specific. There are words and phrases that more women tend to use more than men. There's also geographic differences in that, in the Midwest, you might say pop instead of soda, which I'm in New England. We definitely say soda. Pop is definitely a Midwest thing. And that is also true with signs. I remember being in grad school, I was in Illinois and lived in the Midwest for several years. And I remember even certain signs being made that threw me for a little bit. And I would have to ask someone, like, what does that mean? And it was something that it was a concept that I knew, but even there's colloquialisms in ASL where certain things are signed a little bit differently based on the area. This is true in English, it's true in ASL. Affective is another type of connotation which can evoke a feeling or so a good example of this would be, so in English, one of the things that we're going to talk a lot about in this unit is the differences between ASL and English in this regard, because English has a lot more words, or there's just a higher lexicon in English. We have a lot of different types of words that mean the same thing or similar things. So, for example, the word comfortable has a certain meaning. The word cozy has an I would say almost identical meaning. If you're comfortable, it can be cozy. It's a really nuanced difference between the two words. But the word cozy evokes a feeling that comfortable doesn't. You can be comfortable, it doesn't evoke a feeling. But if you describe a room, oh, she looked very comfortable sitting in the chair. Okay, that just means that she wasn't in pain. But if you describe that she looks cozy, that's a whole different connotation to the word. So going in a little bit deeper on this, the different lexicon relationships of different words and signs, we have a few different categories, which is hypernyms and hyponymy, like synonyms, antonyms, converseness, metaphors. Some of these terms I'm sure you remember from English class way back in the day. So hypernymy and hyponymy. So think about it in terms of categories. So this is true in ASL and again also true in English, that we have categories of words and then we have words that fall under that category. So we might have the larger, the hypernym would be animals. And that encompasses a lot of different things. Just the sign for animal means animal, but it could not any specific one. Then underneath that, we have hyponyms, which are specific animals or things that fall within that larger umbrella or category. Lexical relationships, meronymy, part or whole relationships, or sometimes called partonymy. It's a type of hierarchy that deals with the part whole. So meronymy to the holonym, a meronym, apple, holonym, apple tree. So part of a larger thing. Synonymy is, we're familiar with this in English, where synonyms are things that have the same meaning. As I mentioned, there are some ASL terms. We do synonyms or similar meanings a little bit different in ASL. So the referential meaning might denotate the same thing. The connotation might be affective or social. So the referential meaning might be one thing, but you can also change that meaning slightly for a different connotation or sub-meaning, for lack of a better description. Now, antonyms we actually have a lot more of in ASL. And this is obviously things that mean opposite between two signs. And so these are gradable, and they could be words on a spectrum. So like large, medium, small, hot, warm, cold, and then non-gradable, which are just extremes of two things. So like freezing, normally you'd have comparative or superlative forms in English, like good, better, best. And in freezing, in this depiction, like boiling, you have everything from freezing to boiling and then everything in between in English. And how would we describe that in ASL? We would do that a little bit different, but we still could, the concepts are still there and we could still evoke that meaning, but it would be done in a little bit different way. We don't have different signs for each stage of this. So antonyms in ASL, language users sometimes play with gradable and non-gradable antonyms like half dead or barely alive, freezing cold, depicting verbs or classifier predicates. Gradable words depict differently depending on the type. So object, place, person, a thin book versus a thick book, booklet versus Bible, big baby versus a small baby. So going back to the synonyms and antonyms, one of the things that we tend to do, we don't have as many of synonyms in ASL. We do have more antonyms, but regardless, there's a lot more in English than we do in ASL. And so that is going to change how that meaning is conveyed. So moving on to that. Lexical relationships and converseness. So converseness is a process of changing or converting the class of a word without changing its form. Morphological, same, but different. Wife, husband. So technically, the signs wife and husband are actually compound words. We're signing for husband, it's man, marry, and woman, marry. And those two signs are put together to create the compound or concept of wife, husband. Same thing like teacher and student. Phonological resemblance between pairs of signs like boy and girl, auntie and uncle, aunt and niece. So things that are in the same phonological category, if you will. You'll see a lot of the similarities as you're signing them. Also makes it easier to remember them. Metaphors. Now, metaphors are unique in ASL because there's actually more to it in ASL than even in English. So I'm going to look at my other screen because it's a little too small over there. So a metaphor in English, well, what is a metaphor? Is an expression of one concept in terms of another concept. So there's a similarity or a correlation between the two. There's three kinds of metaphors. So there's an orientational, which is spatial information to communicate the metaphor. Ontological, which is objectifying entities, states, and events, and structural, which is intangible becomes tangible. Now, in ASL, metaphors are simply to imply that the meaning is beneath the superficial understanding. So there's what the sign represents, or it's referential, but then the metaphor and how the sign is produced, and usually how we create the sign, is the metaphor. And what do I mean by that? So, for example, with regard to, say, height is seen as respect. So, even in doing things like good, better, best, we generally will indicate that something is higher in priority or higher up the totem pole, if you will, in creating a sign like this. So this is better and this would be best. Simply by raising our hand higher indicates that it's better than the other thing. And we do this a lot when we use two signs and we have that juxtaposition and we compare them against one another. This creation of higher versus lower usually denotes better, not as good. And we do this with like levels. Well, this is a metaphor to the sign, but it also has significant meaning. So in English, we would have those other kind of metaphorical nuances in the words. In ASL, we generally will do that in where we're the orientation or the movement of the sign. So another example of that would be when we're indicating time, moving forward, moving backward. I always talked about before. This usually indicates in the future. This means backwards. Well, this is all very metaphorical stuff. There's nothing literal about me moving forward when I'm signing versus moving backwards, or specifically that placement. The placement of the sign itself is already pretty much designated, and we're adding in that metaphorical layer and adding that additional meaning when we create the sign in a different way. So when I'm saying will, the sign for will is already designated. You can just sign it this way. It doesn't need to be done any particular way. But if I lean into it a lot more and I'm like, then this has a different meaning that it's going to happen way in the future. And it's not even necessarily articulated except in that metaphorical representation of that additional motion that I did in that sign. We can also look at the different hand shapes. There's certain hand shapes there and their similarities. So the examples that they use here are things like depressed, tired. What are some of the other ones? They just tend to, so a lot of these feeling type signs, they tend to have the same hand shape. So think about things like feel, sad, pity, depressed. They all have the same kind of hand shape. And so, when you see that hand shape, there's a lot of signs that that there's a specific feeling that comes along with that. Lexical relationships, again, metaphor. So there's, again, a strong link between metaphor and iconicity. So double mapping, according to Taub, the relationship between the concrete and the abstract and is widespread in sign languages. So that bent V equals analysis, different families of signs, according to Fishberg and Goff. And I just gave you a couple of examples of those, of like feel, pity, sensitive, sick, concerned, depressed. The whole category, the whole feeling that is along with all of those is a sense of negative or sadness or something like that. Same thing with evil signs or signs that are very negative. So devil, selfish, steal, they use the same hand shape too. And the hand shape in and of itself is a metaphor to the sign that you're using, and gives you a good indication of how that sign is meant, not just in what it means in terms of the word that it represents or the concept that it represents, but its meaning and how you do it. So moving from words and signs to whole sentences and their meanings, or chapter 22. So how do we derive meaning from a sentence? Just toss in all the signs and mix it together and voila, you got yourself a cake. I mean, a concept you can communicate. And this is actually very true. And how we do this in English is not that different, in that the order that we put the words in and sort of that recipe for the sentence is ultimately what the meaning is. And we can put words in different orders because we mean different things, or we want to focus on different things. And so meaning is made by the sign order or word order, the semantic role, the who, what, where, when, why, how it all happened, as well as the agent, patient, experiencer, instrument, cause. So all of the information in that complete thought is a well-designed recipe for communicating that thought to a person. So some semantic roles that take place in a sentence. First of all is the agent, and we use this in ASL by usually this. Sometimes if we literally are indicating agent, but it's the person or thing that's doing the event. So in the larger concept, it's simply, who's the sentence about? So dog chases cat. Well, who's the agent? The dog. The dog is the one that's doing it. Now, if I reverse it, can we just willy-nilly move it around? No, because if I reverse that and I say cat chase dog, that doesn't mean the same thing. That has actually a completely different meaning. So this is not the same thing. The patient is the role of being acted upon by an agent. So in this case, the cat. And again, if you reverse it, they would be the opposite. The cat would be the agent and the dog would be the patient. The experiencer shows the agent or person is experiencing something. So Jane, think, funny, watch, dog. So Jane is now thinking and she's watching the dog chase the cat, and it's funny. Um, Instrument is an inanimate thing that an agent uses to implement an event. So door, key, open. Cause. The causer instigates an event rather than doing it. The tornado destroyed the house. Now, in English, obviously, we have different verbs to indicate this. Now, there's a link here to a YouTube video. I'm not going to play it now, but I'm going to leave the link. I want you to watch the video. It's not a very long one. And indicate the semantic role. And we'll put that in the discussion. Function words or morphemes. So tense, a grammatical category typically marked on the verb that refers to the time of an event or state denoted by the verb in relationship to other temporal reference. So it's a very wordy way of saying we know what a verb tense is. Present tense, past tense, future tense. I run. I ran. I will run. That's how we do it in English. How do we do it in ASL? Very similar, but we use that time continuum. We use the same sign, but we change the direction that the sign is going to indicate the same thing. So I do. Well, actually, that wouldn't work because that would be I did or finish. So we'll go back to run. Run. Ran. How would you do ran? Ran, finished. Or with any verb, you could indicate that it happened before. Aspect is the grammatical category associated with verbs that express a temporal view of the event or state expressed by the verb. The reference is relationship of one linguistic expression to another in which one provides the information necessary to interpret the other. And dexis, reference by means of an expression whose interpretation is relative extralinguistic context. Who is speaking, the time of place of speaking, gestures of the speaker, current location of the discourse. So all of these things, they add additional information and it embellishes the thought. It gives you more content. Is it necessary to make a full thought? No, but it adds different things. So for tense, ASL might use separate lexical terms like last night. And also, again, our non-manual markers, location of the torso in reference to an event on the continuum, as I mentioned. So you might lean back, we might lean forward, or we might kind of sit up straighter, which indicates that it's happening right now and it's very immediate. Aspect is the ASL alters the sign movement, so sitting for a long time. So when we sit, I've been sitting and waiting. Reference, sign determines the specific thing, entity being reference. The boy is being silly. Or, I don't know if it's dexis or deixis. She spelled it two different ways. Spatial deixis. Set it up and refer back to it. 2 more slides. See, I told you this one was going to be faster. All right. Pragmatics is an area of linguistics that investigates how the context relates to the meaning. So it's important to know who is producing the sentence, what his or her relationship is to the person seeing or hearing the sentence, and where the sentence is being produced. I'm hungry. Kid says to mom, husband says to wife, coach says to the team. So depending on how this is being said, or you could be talking about another person. She's hungry. This is important information than just like a random sentence if you don't have the context to go with it. And I don't know why she reduplicates this one. She really wanted you to remember that communication needs these 3 things: context, culture, and community. Okay, so I'm going to end. There's one other, because I don't have a slide for this, but this was some notes that I had. Um, so I had just emphasized when I was reading the chapters too, to really be looking at shades of meaning. So it's not always extremes. Like we talked about boiling versus freezing. Well, those are easier to define and sort of understand because they're extreme antonyms and they actually can be represented by totally different signs. But when we have different gradients of meaning in English, that can be a little bit more challenging to reflect in ASL because we simply don't have as many signs in ASL as we do in English. So to represent happy, we can say in English, I'm happy, I'm glad, I'm excited, I'm elated. Well, elated and happy kind of mean the same thing, but in English, it's very specific and it has a very specific connotation. And in ASL, we don't have a sign specifically for elated. So how would we change? What we generally do is we don't change the sign, but we would change the movement morpheme or the production morpheme. So the morpheme that indicates that movement or how we make it in terms of location or adding um, a manual marker or something like that would alter how that's being produced. So, for example, it might be a facial expression, or it might be, again, in relation to time, you might be moving that sign away or towards you or what have you. In the example of happy, happy just means happy. But if you're elated, how would you change the sign for happy to mean elated? Well, most likely you would add a facial expression to indicate that this isn't just happy, it's taking meaning to the next level. I'm so happy. I'm so happy. I'm so excited. Um, the production of the sign might be a little faster, might be a little bit more urgent. The facial expression, the eyes open, the smile would indicate all of those things that it changes the meaning of the sign itself. And that's the thing that I think that gets lost on a lot of people, that you don't realize that you have actually done linguistically made those changes through doing those different things. All right, I'm going to leave that here. We're going to dive on over to the discussion forums. I'm also going to give you a little reminder too, since we're in week 5, now is a great time for you to do a little bit of a check-in, see how you're doing with assignments or with anything that you might be missing or struggling with. If there's any things that you're behind on, if there's any things that you're just not getting and you're frustrated with, please let me know because we have a couple of weeks that we can tackle it. And then we can go from there. I hope you're all having a fantastic week. Let me know if you have any questions or stop by the office hours, and I'll see you all later. Take care. Bye.